What's up, Dragon Brood? We are diving into more decks with cards from Crimson Vow just to set you up for standard as we move into the new season. So we just did a mono white aggro deck, humans actually, and we're going to take a step into another deck that we played this season here on the channel, which was popular with a lot of our viewers. So I've already diving into this one because it's one people have asked about, but the Abzan Lifegain list. We did get a new piece of this, and this is a good deck to build because you only really need, I believe, one set of 4 of a new card, I think is all we're really playing. So let's hop over and take a look at this Abzan Lifegain list that's almost ready to go right out of the gate. All right, so diving in here, nothing real crazy, nothing over the top. This is just a really fun, really aggressive, grow your creatures big, gain a bunch of life, gives you a bit of an advantage in the aggro matchups, which is going to make this a little appealing in the early part of the season where people might be trying a lot of different types of aggro decks. When you're playing something that gains a lot of life and then also growing your creatures, it can really make it hard for your opponents to punch through. So we're really excited to give that a look here. I will say, go ahead and ignore the sideboard stuff we have here. We don't really have much that's dealing with this. This is kind of carryover from the previous list I ported over. But as far as the main deck cards here, we do have 3 Duresses. I was kind of debating what we were going to do with this slot initially. There's some new cards I thought about playing, but really Duress just solves the problem we need, and mostly it's going to be using that to try to block out sweepers if possible. But occasionally there might be spot removal you want to get rid of or whatever. But I will say, Duress also works against like mono green aggro, right? You can get rid of the Chariots, you can get rid of Ren and Sevens, any of their removal like Blizzard Brawl, right? There's still stuff there that matters that you may want to deal with. We are playing for Lunarch Veteran. This is a card that came out last set. It's a 1/1 for 1, but every time you play a creature, you're going to gain life, which is going to be very critical in this list. But it also does come back as a flyer, which is pretty sweet. And then whenever a creature dies while that's out, you also get to gain life. So it's giving you life both ways. We're playing 2 copies of Valentin, Dean in the Veil, but it's really about Lizette on the opposite side, because Lizette costs 2 green and 2 for a 4/4, but every time you gain life, you get to pay 1, and all your creatures get +1/+1 and trample. Because that's one of the downsides this deck can have at times, is if you don't have evasive maneuvers to get your, well, not that, that's an actual magic card, but if you don't have evasion to get your creatures through, it can be tough when you're sitting there with a couple of like 8/8s, 10/10s that just can't punch through and they're getting chump blocked. Lizette makes sure that doesn't happen. Then we're playing Cleric of Lifespawn, 4 copies. Most of the time you think about this, you think about it in a straight cleric deck. But here we do have enough clerics, actually. There's a bunch of cards in this deck that are clerics that are going to trigger this. And it also grows anytime you gain life for the first time each turn. And since we have a lot of ways to gain life, you're going to be growing this pretty easily. And they're great in multiples, honestly. Now we have Prosperous Innkeeper, partly because this helps smooth out our mana a little bit, but it also lets us gain a lot of life, right? Every creature that comes into play is going to gain life. And again, when you have Cleric of Lifespawn, matter of fact, this list actually has 12 copies of things that can actually gain life every time, or get +1/+1s every time you gain life. And that's one of the reasons the Innkeeper is going to be so big here. Then we have Trellisera. Each time you gain life, get a +1/+1. Awesome. Also, remember that multiple copies of Innkeeper or Cleric of Lifespawn or Lunarch, like, each creature can be adding 3 or 4 counters to our Trellisera, which happens quite a bit. And every time you do that, you get to scry, which is fantastic because after like turn 4 or 5, you don't really want to be seeing a lot of mana or anything. So her just being able to swap cards, get rid of them, maybe even get rid of another Trellisera because she's legendary, right? So I originally didn't want to play 4 in this list, but in my old list, I eventually went up to 4. So I just carried that over and we're going to play 4 in this one as well. And your opponent's going to be trying to remove them. Nothing wrong with having extra ones. Now, we're not going to play a lot of removal in this list because in some ways our creatures are going to be big enough to be our removal, but we are going to play 3 Vanishing Verse. I really kind of toyed around with this idea of what we wanted this removal card to be. I will say, if you want to spin new cards, consider Hero's Demise, right? That is a thing that we can actually... Hero's Downfall, sorry. Hero's Demise is a different magic card. But Hero's Downfall is worth considering. It is double black, so it's a little bit harder to cast, but it does kill a creature or a planeswalker. However, Vanishing Verse lets us get rid of a lot of things. It's going to get rid of a lot of enchantments that are monocolor. It gets rid of chariots. It gets rid of just a ton of things. So I decided to go with Vanishing Verse as my removal of choice here. And now the new card we're playing here, and I want to get this right, is Voice of the Blessed. Sorry, this one only has like a 4-in-1 here, but it's 2 white for a 2/2. Every time you have a creature come into play, it gets a +1/+1 counter. If it has 4 counters on it, it gets flying and vigilance, I believe. And then if you have 10 counters on it, it gets indestructible. The reality is, it's very easy to get 4 counters on this. So it's very likely you're going to have a 6/6 flying vigilance thing. And if there's a lot of aggro decks that if they don't deal with that, once it gets that big, they just don't, and then they're going to be dead. I mean, seriously. And this is great because, again, just like we were talking about earlier, you needed more things in this list that have evasion of some kind. So now, having these in here is great. Now, it is double white, so there's going to be some times it's going to be a little bit more difficult to cast, but we have enough lands that give us multiple colors and a lot of them that give us white, so we should be able to justify this in the list. Now, because we can't help ourselves, Elite Spellbinder, right? We wanted more ways to slow our opponents down, get rid of those key removal cards, those sweepers, and it happens to be a cleric. And we have things that care about clerics, so why not? Speaking of things that care about clerics, we also have Righteous Valkyrie. This card, again, we think about it more in a traditional cleric list or an angel list, but here, again, when you have Lunarch Veteran, Cleric of Lifespawn, Innkeeper, and Righteous Valkyrie itself, and to some extent, if you play an early Valentin, it does have lifelink. This lets you possibly, if you get up to 27 life, just give all your things, even your non-creatures that are growing, just your regular creatures, all +2/+2. So that can get to a game-ending situation all by itself. So, and having more flyers. I think that's another thing too. When we talk about evasive creatures, now you have Spellbinders, you've got Righteous Valkyrie, and possibly the Voice of the Blessed, right? This is all going to be things that your opponent have to deal with. And then we're playing 2 copies of Aura. And this might look a little weird in the list. It's 2 colorless, a white and a black, 3/3, but it does have lifelink. So again, you're talking about gaining life, even if you're just blocking with it. And then anytime you have a cleric die, you get to get something back out of the yard. Well, you know what? You have to get another cleric, but the reality is when you lose a Spellbinder or you lose a Righteous Valkyrie, you can get back a Trellisary, you can get back a Cleric of Lifespawn, all these things that are gaining life, getting bigger, whatever, and kind of just start resetting all over again. So not huge, but it is very useful. Even if it dies itself, you can just get a Righteous Valkyrie back, or maybe you want to get a Spellbinder back, right, and just get those last few points of flying damage. So definitely really big on that. Now the lands are a little bit complicated in this list. I will say, if you already have these lands from the previous set, very good. If you don't have them, this is where you're going to spend a lot of your wild cards. However, you can skimp on lands here or there and make it work. I don't think you necessarily need all of them, but I would play as many copies of each of these that you have. Now, we are playing a full set of the green-white pathway, the Branchloft. We're playing a full set of the Bright Climb pathway. We're also playing a full set of the Dark Boar pathway. Now, admittedly, these are also lands that came out in like Kaldheim and Zendikar, so like they've been around a little bit, but still. We're playing 3 copies of the Overgrown Farmland. This was the multi-land from last set. And then we are playing 3 copies of Shattered Sanctum from the new set. So, but if you notice, we're playing the ones that also make white mana, because we have predominantly more white than anything else. And then we're playing 2 plains and 2 swamps, just because it makes the most sense. Now, we could actually swap those out to play like maybe 1 Hive of the Eye Tyrant or something, which I don't think is bad, actually. So that's something I would consider if you're thinking about what else to play there. I may even have that in the final downloadable list, just so you can have a little bit of extra oomph toward the end of the game to maybe remove something from your opponent's graveyard that could be critical. Maybe, make sure they can't block with a token creature or something late, just so you have that extra menace. Whatever it is, I think that will help out the list quite a bit for you. But again, overall, this deck performed very well in the last season. I expect it to perform well in this season. Now, I will say, while this deck is rare heavy, it's really heavy because of the lands, right? When you're talking about the creatures, there's not all that many rares you have to have, and it is a very fun strategy to play with. But the good news is if you built this from one of our previous versions that we had here on the channel, you're really only having to put 7 new cards in. 3 that are land, which are great because you can play those in several other lists, so you're going to need to craft the lands anyway at some point. So you really only have 4 cards, that's the Voice of the Blessed, that you need to make to put in this. And I will even say if you don't want to craft the Voice of the Blessed, you could play the Cleric, the 2/2 for 2, that's the arena only card, Hallowed something or other, right? You can play that, Hallowed Priest I think is actually what it's called, but you can play that if you want to. Then every time you gain life, it'll get a +1/+1. Now the downside is it doesn't get evasion and it doesn't get indestructible at any point, but if you want to keep playing the list and give yourself fewer wild cards to craft, that's one way you can do it. As always, if you haven't checked it out, please check out the links to our Discord, my streams, and all that fun stuff. It's all in the description. Also, check out my new channel, PowrDragn Reviews and Reacts. There's some fun stuff we're doing over there. And then, you know, like always, like, subscribe, share, all that fun stuff. That's all I have for you for now. We'll see you next time.